Okay, hey everybody. My name is Dr. Dan Fulton. I'm an infectious disease doctor here at Mary Greeley and at McFarland Clinic. And today we're going to be talking about COVID-19, particularly with reference to kind of a focus on booster vaccinations, but a whole bunch of stuff. So we're going to get going, and if I go over, I apologize. Feel free to leave in the middle if you need to. I don't mean to hold you hostage. There was too much to get in a brief amount of time. So I have nothing to disclose. I don't work for any companies. All I do is provide healthcare. This is our fifth town hall that we've done about COVID. The first one was in March 2020 when we were just trying to figure out what this thing was and, what we would do about it and how to prepare. The second one was in May 2020 when we talked a little bit about our approach and what we were doing and what we were seeing and how that was affecting the approach. The next one was in December 2020, and that one was where we talked about the vaccines as they were just coming out and available for healthcare. And I think I wanted to bring up those in particular because, at that time there was this sort of sense of urgency about COVID. We were learning about it. And then in December, we had these new vaccines. And I think, for all of us being on the front lines here, that was just such a welcome event that there was this sense of urgency. And as time has gone on, I think we've all become more accustomed to COVID. We've been living with it now for a year and a half, and it does sort of decrease the sense of urgency, I think, for talks like this. And I think that also makes it harder to make it feel like a talk like this is like really relevant. My goal is to talk about as much data-driven things as we can to help as many people as possible sort of see the bigger picture and then also drill down deep in a few particular areas. The folks that I think would benefit most from this talk are going to be people that are in healthcare. I also think that there's going to be a fairly big focus on folks that have so far not been vaccinated, partially in an effort to make sure that they have all the data they need to be making good decisions. And then finally, I think for people that are considering getting a booster vaccine, we've had a lot of changes just in the past 4 days to the status of that. We expect more changes in the next few days. I waited to start preparing for this talk until Saturday night to try and have as much data as we could have. And then when I, looked at things this morning, my talk was already at least a little bit irrelevant. So take all of that in mind, that this continues to be a rapidly changing information landscape. So along with that, I couldn't help but think about this and the music that goes along with it and how far away 3 months ago feels. So 3 months ago, we did our fourth COVID town hall, and at that time, it was the middle of June, and we had no COVID patients in the hospital. And we talked a little bit about, what we hoped would happen, how we were hoping things would go. And I did have this one slide that mentioned this thing called Delta variant, which you may or may not have remembered me talking about, but it was a little bit concerning at that time because we were seeing these things happening in England, which was a fairly well-vaccinated population, and still Delta variant seemed like it was taking off. Delta variant was originally sort of described in India and caused a lot of the severe disease that we saw in India back in the spring. So the point is that medicine will make you humble, and you just never know what will happen, and we just have to keep moving forward. Because now, just 3 months later, we're looking at a totally different landscape. And so what happened, well, we hoped vaccines would really turn the corner, but uptake was waning, even at the time of this talk. And then Delta variant is much more contagious. So here's Delta variant, basically through some very subtle changes in the lock and key mechanism of how COVID gets into the body, it becomes much more efficient and so can spread much more easily. So instead of averaging, one person infecting 2 people, which from the standpoint of a respiratory disease is a really bad deal, now Delta variant in unvaccinated populations is causing up to 5 new infections per person. So that just changes the dynamics of how quickly it spreads and also decreases the amount of exposure you need in order to get infected. And here you can see through CDC data that basically 99% of the COVID that we're seeing is Delta variant. So I still do have people ask, do you think I have Delta variant versus some other one? So we don't test at our level for Delta variant, but the public health departments do. And so the Iowa Department of Public Health checks a certain percentage of the tests for different variants, and basically at this point, almost everything we see is Delta variant. And it's again because of this increased contagiousness that allows it to emerge more quickly. And that really has been a game changer. So this is what we're seeing in the United States. This is where we were 3 months ago, feeling like we were really on the cusp of going back towards what felt like normal. And now we see this being driven here, these new high rates. And I want you to just look at last summer. So we did see some bumps last summer, particularly in the South, probably related to weather. It's just really hot, so people stay inside. And so we're seeing that. This is primarily in the South. So if you think about our local rates here, that gives us a little bit of pause about what we're facing over the next few months, because we had our peak in October and November last year. So this is the current sort of hot spots as of this morning. So, just a month or two ago, it was really hot kind of right in this area. It's moved more into Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia. We're seeing a lot of disease in Idaho, with very limited resources there, leading to basically crisis standards of care being implemented, which really is healthcare rationing in a limited setting in a way, which is pretty scary. It means that if you have a heart attack or a stroke, you may not be able to get a hospital bed because they're just not available. But I wanted to show this right next to, here's kind of the vaccine rates map. And part of that is because I wanted you to notice one thing here. So West Virginia hasn't done too bad with their vaccines, and yet they're still in the midst of a pretty severe outbreak as it is. And so I think the point is that, if we're talking about vaccine rates in the, 50s to 60s for the eligible population, plus if we add, all the kiddos who can't be vaccinated yet on top of that, that still leaves a lot of people that have not yet had COVID, and who are not vaccinated. And with the contagiousness of Delta, we can expect many of those people to get infected over the next coming months, which I think is what leads to these incredibly intense hotspots popping up throughout the country. So I'm not a pediatrician, so I can't speak a lot about what COVID does in kids, but I can say that still, even with much higher rates of infection right now in kids, which are probably because there's just so much COVID running around, and because we're all trying to get back towards normal with schools and activities, that we're seeing the numbers in children go up and up and up. The number of kiddos that are getting severely ill doesn't seem like it's changed that much. So they still estimate about 1% of kids that get COVID get hospitalized. And then even fewer of those end up in intensive care, and even fewer of those end up dying. Anybody that gets really sick from COVID is a tragedy, and 1% sounds pretty good unless it's your kid. So, I think we just have to keep doing what we can do to keep the kiddos healthy. And along those lines, we got this breaking news this morning that the Pfizer vaccine looks like it's going to be effective and safe for 5 to 11-year-olds. So they estimate maybe by Halloween that'll start coming out under an EUA, just like the other ones did. They initially had been saying September, but the holdup here was that because there were slightly higher rates of myocarditis in younger patients over 16, they had to make these studies bigger in order to assess the safety in younger people, so these littler kids, just to make sure that there was not any signal of, higher rates the younger you got. They also decreased the dose by, it's a third of the dose, so it's only 10 micrograms instead of 30 of the vaccine, and so that generated a really solid immune response on par with what they were generating in adults with the higher dose, and they didn't see any cases of myocarditis in about 3,000 kids. So remember, the rates of myocarditis are still on the order of 1 in 100,000. So you'd have to do, basically that many vaccines to capture that, but at least we didn't see anything higher than that with this level of safety. So, the proof is always in what you would do for your own kids, and so I would get my own kids vaccinated if it came to it. So I do think this is helpful to look at where we're at in Iowa. Last year, if we look at where we were at in June, July, August, we were kind of middling along with what I felt like was a rising tide. And then as we hit late October, November, that's when we really spiked. And so we're kind of in a similar area now. We went from our very low numbers to what feels like a rising tide. I think we've got around 15 in the hospital right now. And it's just been a couple more every week, it seems like. It's just slightly more every week, to the point that starting at the end of last week, we are starting to limit some of our elective procedures in order to have space. Time will tell if we spike the way we did last year, but based on what we've seen in other states, having similar spikes to the way they had last year around the similar time, I don't have any reason to think that won't happen unless we have a dramatic change in our vaccination rates. And I also think it's really important to remember that everything we see here, March 2020 up till really spring, there were still pretty heavy restrictions, mandates, and self-imposed restrictions. People weren't doing much, a lot of skipped events, skipped holidays, skipped birthdays, all that stuff. I just don't think there's an appetite for that anymore. I just don't think people can keep doing that, for a lot of reasons. I just think that for people's general health and, why do we want to be alive at all anyway? It's to be with people. And I think going forward, we need to get back to those things. But it's important to remember that we saw this spike even with those restrictions. So then we have the vaccine starting widespread here, and now we're kind of back here. So it's not exactly apples to apples. It's apples to oranges quite a bit, and I still think, though, we can expect a spike. So who's that spike going to be in? It's going to be almost completely in unvaccinated people. So this is the state of Iowa. So 88% of people in the ICU are unvaccinated, and 77% in the hospitals are unvaccinated. And I would say that very closely mirrors our data here, and I'll show you that data a little later. But if I could just share my personal experience with this, these folks here generally are pretty deeply immunocompromised if they've been vaccinated. So we've had folks that had active leukemia. We've had folks that have primary immune deficiencies where they just don't make antibody, or they're on chemotherapies that prevent them from being protected by vaccination. The few people we've had over here, it's been a little bit of a grab bag. Some of them are admitted with non-COVID related things like diabetes. We've got a patient today with that scenario. He's not sick from COVID. He has diabetes, but he has to be in the ICU. And then we've also had patients, in their 90s that got COVID, got weak from COVID, but then had a secondary thing happen because of that. I can say that we've not had anybody die who was vaccinated. This is real, and this is happening throughout the country, and it's primarily unvaccinated folks that are getting sick. So vaccine rates in Iowa, we're doing pretty good with the over 65 crowd, which is great because those are the folks that get most ill from COVID. I think our personal experience here is that the folks that we're seeing come in very ill and ending up in the intensive care unit seem to be running in their 50s and 60s, probably because that's where we've got this kind of mix of lower vaccination rates plus still higher risk related to age-related things. I think the average age of our ICU COVID patients right now is a little over maybe like 55 or so. We've got a number. But in general, it's much lower than it was last year at this time. Probably just reflecting this higher unvaccinated status. And in the last month, the youngest person we've had has been 18. And we've had a number of 22-year-olds as well. So this is no longer, the younger crowd is not dodging admission, anymore the way they did last year. And that's probably a reflection of the contagiousness of Delta, and it doesn't take as much to make you really sick. So here is our vaccine rates for the 65 and up crowd. I want to say way to go, Story County and Public Health. We're at 96% of our senior citizens are vaccinated. And
96% of our senior citizens are vaccinated. I don't know how to turn this up, unless you know how to work this computer, Maria, and you want to hear it.
Hello. I'm not sure who's out there, but yeah, I agree. 96% of our folks are vaccinated. And you know, you can see actually that people over 65 generally have done pretty well, but there are areas within kind of our referral and catchment area that are down towards 75. And that's a group of folks that's going to be at high risk of coming in really sick. And if you look at kind of everybody that's eligible 12 and up, we're at about 61%. So that still leaves a lot of folks unvaccinated. So I do think we just need to talk about this. So who is unvaccinated? And I think it's the first thing that we need to talk about is that people that aren't vaccinated are regular people. And it's really easy to get distracted by disagreements or arguments or anything else about what's going on. And so I really want to start by saying how much I appreciate our healthcare teams here and the way they've approached folks that are not vaccinated, which is basically to treat them as a real person, and none of that other stuff matters when you're with us. You are our patient, we're taking care of you. But unvaccinated folks do account for the grand majority of these new infections, and I think, you know, if you think back to a year ago when, you know, for all the frontliners, there was songs and pizza and things being given out, you know, at this point, we're kind of just getting through with our healthcare providers, and people are tired and burnt out. And I think they would say, you know, forget the songs, forget the pizza, just go get vaccinated, because that's what's going to make a difference in the hospital and for them. So if we look at people that are choosing not to get vaccinated more generally, though, it's important to remember that this is a wide group, and they have a lot of different reasons that they don't or that they've so far chosen not to be vaccinated. And I think it's easy to think about the folks here at the bottom. So these are the folks that don't do any vaccines, that sort of subscribe to belief systems that really reject what I would call a science-based approach. If you go higher up on the list, though, these are the people that I actually encounter in real life. These are the people that I see in clinic or that I talk to here on staff. And there's a lot of folks that have had COVID that, you know, believe they have some degree of immunity, and they're not wrong, and we're going to talk about that. There is a difference between people that have definite COVID that's diagnosed and people that say, well, I was pretty sick, you know, last year, but I never had a test. Those are different things. I'm talking only about folks that have a documented infection. You know, they are partially protected already, and we'll talk about that. I think there's a large group of people that are concerned about immediate side effects, and the biggest group of these folks is pregnant women, because in general, in pregnancy, we do take caution with vaccines, especially live virus vaccines. Fortunately, our current vaccines are not live viruses, so they fall into a different category. But pregnancy is a sacred space, and I think it deserves extra attention. And fortunately, we have some science that's helping us out on that front. So we're going to talk about that. The other immediate side effects group that we should talk about are people that basically have heard some terrible story that sounds really tragic. You know, so-and-so got the vaccine, and the next day something bad happened. And it's natural for us to look retrospectively and make connections. That's how our brains work. And so we'll talk about that too. But these are reasonable people that are trying to take good care of their health. There are people that are concerned about long-term side effects. We've heard a lot about concerns about fertility. We're going to talk about that because there's some good science coming out that I think should allay those concerns. I think people also have this kind of what I'd call vague notion that this just all happened pretty quickly. It's not that they're against vaccines in general. They got all their other vaccines, but they just thought this happened pretty fast. And then also people that read something on social media. So you might see that there's a little bit of a connection here. There's a lot out there on social media that we just have to get past. and we'll talk more about that, but again, if I can have you take one thing home, if you're not vaccinated, I think you should talk to your doctor. I mean, I think they will give you good advice about your particular health situation. And I can say that having talked to a lot of people, and I just talked to somebody earlier this week who, has some health issues that I said, actually, yeah, you need to get that figured out before you get vaccinated, because the vaccine may affect the evaluation of that thing you're doing. And so if you meet with your doctor, they're going to give you good advice about the when and the how of taking care of your health. There is a group of folks that just don't trust the government in general. And not all those people are conspiratorial. A lot of those folks just kind of have a general sense that, the government doesn't always make right decisions, and they have this feeling that the government pushed these vaccines. And I think generally speaking, the government is involved with vaccines, especially COVID-19 vaccination, from a standpoint of funding and from a standpoint of regulation. But remember that these vaccines are produced by companies who have a vested interest in your safety, because if the vaccines don't do well, then they don't have a product. So the government has always been involved in helping make recommendations about all vaccines, but those are recommendations. It's really these companies that are making these things. And then there's a number of conspiracies out there, big conspiracies, that governments made COVID and they did it so that they could release the vaccine later. And, those things are pretty far out there, and I don't find any value in arguing about that kind of stuff with people. So I'd just like you to let that kind of stuff go. It's just not worth it. And then this bottom group, is probably the most vexing group of all, partially because, there's a very small people that really run or drive this group, and they are really in it for alternative reasons, different products they sell or alternative approaches to healthcare in general. And what's interesting is when COVID came out, this group highly mobilized, and they're on record saying that they were going to use COVID to try and scare people about vaccines. And the saddest story of all I heard was a spouse of a patient recently who said, I always used to get my vaccines, but now that COVID came out, now I'm not going to get any vaccines ever again. And that's a sign that these messages are really permeating out into the community, and they're not based on science. And actually, if you look into the claims that are made, the folks that are making them know they're not true. They know they're not true, but they have an alternative benefit from that approach. These are not the people that I see in clinic. These are not the people that you talk to about vaccines. This is a very small group of folks, and so we shouldn't think about all folks who are unvaccinated in that group. That's just not true. So I've said time and again, anger is a dead end, and we should not, spend time being angry. But I guess I think about that from the standpoint of, if we're fighting with each other, it doesn't do us any good, and it just leads people to dig into their positions and back away. And I think we should try to keep doors open, especially when it comes to talking about vaccines. The flip side of that is anger can be motivating, and so you can take this opportunity, if you're feeling frustrated that more people aren't vaccinated, to think about what will actually help, and that's the courage part. So, if you reach out to people, if you remain positive, if you talk with people and remain kind, I think you're going to get a lot farther down the road if you just stick with anger. So, just so we know, is COVID actually bad? Yes, it's bad. Amber Deerdorf sent this to me. I found this hugely helpful. But just for perspective, this is how many people die from lightning strikes every year. When there's a big storm, I generally go inside. I take some precautions. I don't throw caution to the wind. I think most people do that. Even so, sadly, this happens to, I think it's about 25 people a year. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about lightning strikes, though. We've got a lot of storms here, and just don't worry about it. I worry a lot when I go to the ocean. It's been many years since I went to the ocean. But when I do, I'm really scared of these shark attacks. And it's really important to know that, this is super rare. This almost never happens. And so it's important to point out that we have these non-rational responses to things that we fear that are not based on something that's actually true. Shark attacks are incredibly rare, and we really shouldn't spend much time worrying about them. We should worry more about drowning in the ocean, which is not something that I've spent a lot of time worrying about, and I've, happily played in the waves before. But, 4,000 people a year die from drowning, and a lot of people swim, and a lot of people go to pools and don't really think twice about it. in part because we're used to it. We've sort of normalized the behavior of swimming, and yet it's something that we should, be thoughtful about. And that's why we do swimming lessons, and we invent in these preventative things for our children and our communities to try and keep this kind of thing from happening. So how many people die in car accidents? Well, if this is, it says Soldier Field, but let's just pretend it's Jack Trice. So about 38,000 people die from car accidents every year. Most people continue to drive despite the risk of driving because driving serves a useful purpose in our lives. So we accept this risk, it's sad, we mitigate it how we can by not driving drunk and wearing our seat belts and all those things. Even so, this still happens. And so that, kind of fills up about half of the stadium. This is how many people on average die from influenza every year, about the same amount, 36,000 people. Almost none last year because we all stayed home and wore masks. But, still, think about that stadium, think about half that stadium worth of people dying on an average year. So this is how many people have died from COVID so far. So as you can see, that's a lot of people. And it's almost beyond imagining. This is how many people have died since vaccines were widely available. And if you look at this one end zone section, this is how many of those people were vaccinated. So if you're trying to think about, is COVID severe? Yes, it is. And if you're trying to think about, do vaccines help? Yes, they do. If we think about this another way, about half the US population is vaccinated. So you would expect that about half the people that have died, if the vaccine didn't work, should be in people that are unvaccinated. But what we see instead is that these are the folks that have died from COVID, and this is the people that have been fully vaccinated. And again, these folks have deep immune issues, generally speaking, organ transplants, chemotherapy, leukemia, etc. So the vaccines are incredibly effective. So moving beyond that, let's talk a little bit about what we call natural immunity. So we hear about this a lot. Somebody doesn't want to be vaccinated because they've already been infected. And we should listen to that because there's truth to that. People that have already had COVID and recovered are less likely to get infected later on. And there have been data to support that. Probably the biggest study that I see references this Cleveland Clinic study that showed among healthcare workers who, again, are active and working and generally healthy, after they had documented COVID infection with a positive PCR test, they didn't have any infections later on. The critique of this study is that it was done before Delta variant came out. And so we have to remember that if people are saying, well, I don't need to be vaccinated, this study falls down because of the Delta variant concern. But the principle is here. Your natural immune system does protect you. This study just came out of Israel because they're busy doing multiple new vaccines and boosters. And basically they found that people... They found that people that had been infected previously were less likely to get infected in general, and they were even less likely to get infected than people that were greater than 6 months out of their vaccine. They also found that people that had been infected and got vaccinated were the least likely to get COVID. So people that had already been infected and then went on to get vaccinated later were much less likely than everybody to get COVID. So generally speaking, your immune system does a good job. Generally speaking, getting vaccinated beyond that helps your immune system be ready for new variants. And also, vaccines, time and again, are shown to decrease the risk of dying. I can say that we've not had anybody that was vaccinated die, but we have had people that have previously been infected and not vaccinated die in our hospital. So when I think about this phenomenon, what I think about is your natural immunity responds to an infection by creating a broad immune response. These are all a whole bunch of different proteins that your immune system responds to when you get infected with COVID. One of those proteins is the spike protein. This is, remember, the lock and key of what allows COVID to get into your cells. So if you're able to create an immune response above a certain threshold, then this immune response is able to protect you from reinfection. And I beg forgiveness from all the immunologists that may watch this talk, because this is totally simplified for all of us. So it's much more complicated than this, but this is just how I think about it. When we do a vaccine, this is how a vaccine works. So the vaccine provides you a single protein that really sticks to that lock and key mechanism. It doesn't give you any other proteins here, but because it goes up above this threshold, it also is able to protect you. So what can happen? Well, a few things can happen. We can have a new variant come through, like Delta variant, that increases this threshold higher. We can also, if you've been naturally infected, you can go on immune suppression medicines that then decrease your ability to respond. And remember, a lot of the folks with COVID that come into the hospital, we give steroids to and other immune suppressing medicines, so we're not sure how robust of a treatment response or an immune response they'll have over time. And the same would be true of vaccine-generated immunity. You'd have decreased response related to that. So if the threshold is higher and your immune response is lower, that puts you at risk for repeat infection. So what can you do? Well, you could go and intentionally try and get COVID again. That might re-stimulate your immune system, although you may not like the side effects of getting COVID again. You would probably get sick. You may miss work. You may have other complications, and like I said, you could get really sick. Or the alternative is to get vaccinated. So you have kind of a scenario like this where you have both, and that's actually been shown to be sort of super immunity. You really are very well protected in that scenario. Or if you've only been vaccinated, basically another vaccine pushes up this spike even higher so that then again you get to this protective level. So a few questions would be, how quickly does that spike then drop again? And aren't we worried that couldn't a new variant push this even higher and make the vaccines even less effective? And I would say yes and yes, those are possible things. But we're not making these decisions in a vacuum. We're making them in this scenario where we have stadiums full of people dying. And so we need to remember that if we can get as many people above this line as it is, that's what we need to do to protect the community. Also remember that COVID still needs to be able to get into your cell. So if it changes its key too much, then it no longer fits in the lock. So there are limits to how much COVID is able to mutate from the standpoint of getting around vaccinations. I don't know if we're going to need more vaccines in the future. Is this a yearly thing or every 10-year thing? I know that when I got Hep B vaccination, I got it at month 0, 1, and 6, and I still have protective immunity against hepatitis B, and I'm glad I haven't gotten hepatitis B. And that was 20 years ago. So I think time will tell. We get tetanus shots every 10 years is what it is. But the big discussion has been around, do we need booster shots now? So healthcare providers, we got our shots starting back in December, so we're pushing 9 months out. And I think we're going to talk about that in a second. So before we get into boosters, let me talk about this. So if you've been infected, couldn't you just measure your antibody levels? Doesn't that seem reasonable? Just see if you're protected. Isn't there a way to measure that? The problem is that the antibodies that are commercially available can tell you only if you've been infected before or not, or been vaccinated before or not, but they don't tell you if you're protected. You have to do a neutralization assay. That's a very technically complicated process that is not commercially available. So even though I have a protective antibody, I don't know if it actually will protect me if I'm re-exposed. So this sort of creates all sorts of issues when you're trying to come up with a policy of how to protect people within the healthcare realm. So for example, we have influenza vaccine mandates where if you don't get vaccinated for influenza, you have to wear a mask during influenza season. That's been our standard approach for many years. And we have a similar thing, or at least we were moving towards a similar thing in June, where unvaccinated people needed to keep their masks on when COVID was really ramping down. Now we're all wearing our masks again because COVID is ramping up. So you really don't see any difference in terms of the approach between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. We looked at this early on to say, couldn't we also measure antibody levels or see if somebody had been previously infected because they might be partially protected? But the problem is there's a lack of adequate data telling us how long that protection lasts, and there's a lack of logistical means to figure out who all those folks are, which is where the recommendation to just go get vaccinated comes from. I think we here at Mary Greeley and McFarland had attempted to take an approach of avoiding vaccine mandates. And the reason was that our vaccine rates here in our healthcare community are incredibly high, pushing up towards 90%. And if the goal is to protect patients and to protect each other, then moving forward with a mandate didn't seem like it was adding that much, but it did seem like it was pushing people away. And so we thought, let's not take that approach. Let's try to keep the door open and let's move forward. And since then, as I'm sure you've heard, we've moved into a different era where now there's a federal mandate for people in healthcare and an OSHA regulation for large companies where mandates are being made at a level above us. And that becomes a challenge because we're with CMS and we need to be compliant. So I think people will see those mandates coming if they aren't already. And part of the reason for this talk, I think, was to try and provide you folks with the information you need to be able to make decisions in that reality. Yeah, okay, I just talked about this. So it is what it is. We have to deal with those mandates as they are. We have to deal with the fact that you may have been infected and are probably mostly protected. But also I'm telling you the vaccines are incredibly safe and they actually increase the effectiveness of your natural immunity going forward. And we're going to talk about some of the other concerns people have had. Remember, all of this is within the context of stadiums full of people dying. So let's talk about the vaccines. This was a fantastic study that just came out of Israel. And basically, the Israelis have had a deal with Pfizer where, they give access to their national healthcare database, and then Pfizer gives them, discounted vaccines. And so basically what they've shown was if you vaccinate the whole population, how much can you expect to see different side effects? And so the blue is the vaccinated folks, and the yellow is the folks that have not been vaccinated. So getting COVID vaccinated actually protects your kidneys. And how would that be? Well, if you don't get COVID, then you don't get renal failure. So getting vaccinated protects your kidneys. It doesn't cause appendicitis. It protects you from arrhythmias because you don't get COVID and you don't have arrhythmias. It protects you from DVT. So this is specifically the Pfizer. Because people that get COVID get DVTs. So it's actually protecting you from getting COVID and getting those things. There is a very slight increase in the chance of getting shingles after COVID vaccination. That's probably because your immune system is busy working through the vaccine and loses sight of the chickenpox you got when you were a little kid. It's a very small effect, but I have seen it. People have gotten shingles after vaccination on the rates of like 1 in 100,000. It decreases your chance of brain bleeding. You do have a higher risk of getting some lymph node enlargement. So if you're in the process of getting lymph nodes already evaluated that are enlarged, you may want to get that evaluation finished before you get COVID vaccinated. It protects you from heart attacks because you don't get COVID. And then this is the most important one and why I appreciate this study. So we have heard that with Pfizer and Moderna, there is a low risk of getting heart inflammation, particularly in younger people. The rates of that are about 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000, somewhere in there. But remember, COVID causes myocarditis too. And so if you get COVID, your risk of getting myocarditis is actually higher than if you get the vaccine. And these are just unvaccinated people. So the rates of myocarditis in COVID infection is much higher than in the vaccination. So if that's your concern, your reason for not getting vaccinated, remember you're not actually protecting yourself. You're not choosing between vaccine and nothing. You're choosing between vaccine and the high risk of getting COVID since it's so contagious right now. Same is true for pericarditis, much more common in COVID, and blood clot in the lung, much more common in COVID, enough that vaccination was almost statistically protective for that. This is incredibly interesting, and I think it puts in context the protective effect of vaccination. This is just another way to look at it. So lymph node enlargement, much higher after vaccination compared to people that didn't get vaccinated. But again, these are benign and they go away. This is something I read about a lot when I try to go down the rabbit holes of seeing why people aren't getting vaccinated. The vaccine adverse events reporting system is basically created to help people after vaccines come on the market to monitor for these very rare events like myocarditis. And so that's actually how myocarditis was found, was through this process. I hear this database getting quoted a lot because they do keep track of everybody that dies within 1 month of being vaccinated. So far, 7,600 people have died within 1 month of getting vaccinated in the United States. I told you that part of being a human means that you try to create connections. And so if somebody got a vaccine and then a week later they have a stroke, it's very normal, I would say, to look back and say, are those two connected? But you have to remember that correlation is not causation. If we gave 150 million people coloring books all at the same time, many of those people would go on to have heart attacks and strokes and get cancers because those things happen anyway. And so the goal of science is to try and figure out, are any of these things happening at a higher rate than they would have had we not done anything at all, or just given you coloring books instead of a vaccine? And we were vaccinating people that are 103. We were vaccinating people with advanced cancers. We vaccinated everybody to try and prevent them from getting sicker. So remember, when you hear people talking about, I'm at risk of dying from COVID vaccination, they're talking about this data, and when we analyze these deaths, they are not attributable in general to COVID-19 vaccination. The exception to that, and as it says down here, was the people that got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There was a very low rate of low platelets and blood clots, which led to a few people dying. That's the most we've got in terms of cause of death. Otherwise, this is all just random. This is just random people living their lives having a coincidental heart attack or stroke or something else after their vaccine. The vaccines aren't causing these things. They're also not causing neurologic issues in general, especially the mRNA vaccines. There's a very slight signal about the Guillain-Barré, the tingling in your hands and feet, and nerve dysfunction with the Johnson & Johnson. That's on the order of 1 to 1 million. They are not associated with any increase in autoimmunity, so people having rates of vasculitis or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or anything else. They're just not there. And these are big studies that are coming out of that adverse events database, because that's how we can study these things. Rates of anaphylaxis are 2.5 in a million, so incredibly rare rates. And those are people that have to go to the emergency department, get steroids, get epinephrine. I don't know that we've had any here, not that I've heard about. Amber's saying no. Again, I mean, it's incredibly rare, so we wouldn't expect to see anything like that here. So, do you need a booster shot? So, these are data that I shared 3 months ago. So, vaccine-induced immunity does seem to be pretty steady out to 6 months. Pretty steady out to 6 months. There's that neutralization line that I was kind of showing you with my whiteboard earlier. And then here's an age distribution. And so you can see that there was some significant decrease in immunity in people over 65 compared to people that were under 65. So it turns out our immune systems sort of peak at age 32. Then they start to get weaker. And the older you are, your immune system just does not function as well over time. So there was some hint that something was going on even then. Different data over time have suggested that the vaccines are less effective for Delta. This is interesting. A lot of our data about do you need boosters or not is coming out of Israel. And Pfizer vaccine did seem in the Israeli population to be less effective against Delta. In other populations, it didn't seem to lose that effect. So you have to remember the population you study, and is that generalizable to everybody else? It just happens to be that a lot of our data comes from the Israelis. And then there was this discussion about Delta becoming more contagious, and even though your risk of getting COVID in the era of Delta is significantly decreased, on the order of 80, maybe 65%. So you're less likely to get it at all. But if you do, it seems like you are as likely to be contagious as if you hadn't been vaccinated. That's based on how much virus do we actually find in your nose. I don't know that that's been shown in like a real world, like home contact tracing studies or anything like that. But, the point here is to try and be safe. And so when we saw this, that's where the recommendations for vaccinated people to wear masks, especially in high prevalence times, came from. People that are immunocompromised do not make protective antibody at the same rate, and that was something that was shown early on, and we have continued to see folks who are deeply immunocompromised get sick from COVID. So it was based on that the recommendation for immunocompromised people get a third shot. It was really based on this data that we saw that they were still at risk of getting infection and didn't have protective immunity. So that's already happening. Anybody that has deep immunosuppression of blood cancers or on chemo or anything else, we already recommend you go get a third shot. You can go get it today. However, the government was looking at this data about decreasing immune function over time and wondering, do we need to do booster shots? And so I think they started planning for that. And we started planning for it here too, because these are big logistical undertakings. It takes a lot of vaccine to vaccinate 150 million people. And so we started hearing these reports that this was the plan. They were planning for it, but it was never the plan. The FDA has been working to look at data as it becomes available to see if this is actually helpful or not. So then we heard on Friday the FDA had finally looked at this data in depth, and we also got a big study out late last week too in people over 60. And basically what they're recommending is if you're over 65, you should consider getting a booster shot, or if you're in a high-risk group. Now, we don't know exactly what they meant by that yet. You can read their whole report. It's out there. I think they lay this out really nicely. It's publicly available. I read the whole thing. And, I think what they're trying to do is balance that decreasing immunity over time with the protective benefit of vaccination. So this is the big study that came out. Again, this is out of Israel. And basically what they showed was that if you'd had 2 shots and you got a third shot, within a week or 2 of getting that third shot, your risk of getting COVID went down dramatically. What was hard for me to tell out of this study was what was the rate of COVID infection after just 2 shots. They report it went down, but how far did it go down? That was hard. The study didn't get into that, but I presume it would be on the order of this 60% decrease that they had reported previously. So they showed that it didn't seem like it had any significant side effects, and it decreased the risk of infection and severe illness. The follow-up of this was pretty short. It was just a couple weeks after they had completed the study that they got this data out there. This was only in people over 60. So I think it was on that basis that the FDA is looking at this, plus a whole bunch of other data that's being provided by the companies to make this recommendation of people over 65 consider getting a booster shot. Oh, this is the proprietary data from Pfizer in terms of what they looked at was if you were vaccinated between like December and February compared if you were vaccinated between March and June, what were your rates of infection? And the rates of infection did seem to go up the longer ago you were vaccinated. So think about healthcare community, we were all vaccinated by and large back in December and January. They also have this data showing that it's pretty safe, although they did see some increase in lymph nodes developing. So we've heard these stories, people getting some lymph nodes that enlarge with COVID vaccination. Before it's less than 1% of people, and they measured that at about 5% of people. So if you're somebody that's getting a COVID booster shot, keep that in mind. But generally speaking, it didn't seem, they have not seen any unexpected or big side effects. This is our data here from Mary Greeley, and you can see that once vaccines have become widely available, starting back here, our percent of unvaccinated people accounts for about 85% of our hospital admissions. Vaccinated people accounts for about 15%. And I can say, generally speaking, they're quite elderly or immunocompromised. So would I recommend a third vaccine dose? Yes, definitely if you have an immune problem. No question about it. I just think you're at risk of COVID making you really sick still, and we should try and boost that spike antibody as much as we can. I do think that there's enough data, so if you are over 65, you should consider getting a booster shot. I would say that not all over 65-year-olds are the same. So if you're 85 and you have heart disease and COPD, your risk of COVID is going to be a lot higher than if you're 65 and otherwise totally healthy person. So I think generally speaking, the data is there to support this. I would encourage it more the older somebody is and the more medical problems they have, even if they're not immunocompromised. For we in healthcare who are under 65, not yet. We're not seeing anything to suggest that. It'll be interesting if they say high-risk people includes healthcare workers. I would like to see what these studies look like in younger people to see if it's needed. Does it actually provide a benefit or not? Because younger people generally have stronger immunity, like we talked about. What's going to get really interesting with all of that is if the federal government extends a vaccine mandate to include booster shots in the absence of really good data. The data may emerge. I'm not saying we'll never get them. We might, and it might be 3 months from now or 6 months from now. But I just think I would still like to see more robust data saying they're necessary before we go vaccinating everybody, over 18 with a third shot. I do think it's coming, though. I think eventually, just like my Hep B vaccine series, you're probably going to need a third shot, and then the goal would be that would last a long time. Okay, so common questions. The biggest one we get, I think, is still folks that are pregnant or nearing pregnancy or considering pregnancy sometime in the future. So let's dig into this data a little bit. If you were trying to figure out, do COVID vaccines cause problems in pregnancy, you would need to compare people that got vaccinated in pregnancy compared to people that have not gotten vaccinated in pregnancy. And the reason I say that is because sadly, miscarriages happen. We've had 2 in my family. They come out of the blue. You weren't expecting it, and they're devastating. Imagine getting a vaccine 2 or 3 days prior and then having a miscarriage. And it would be totally natural for you to connect those 2 things in your mind. But the only way to know if one caused the other would be to do a big study and compare people that got vaccinated with people that did not. The rate of miscarriage in people that are unvaccinated, historically speaking, is about 15%. So in women that got vaccinated while pregnant, and this includes women that were vaccinated even before they knew they were pregnant, so very, very early on in development, women that were vaccinated because they chose to, later on because of their risk of getting exposed to actual COVID infection, basically what we saw was there was no increased rate of miscarriage. So in these 800 women, the risk of miscarriage, or the rate of miscarriage, was 12.6, and historically speaking, it's about 15%. So we did not see any difference. We also didn't see any difference in preterm birth, small size for gestation, congenital abnormalities, or unexpected newborn deaths. We didn't see any change in the outcome of pregnancy. I've had many friends approach me about this question, and I can tell you that 6 months ago, I said, you need to think about this long and hard because we don't have data yet. I can't tell you for sure it's safe. And, what are you going to do if you get vaccinated and you have a miscarriage a couple days later? You're going to wish that you had that information. Different women have different perspectives, though, and different women have different exposure levels to COVID, like, for example, nurses that were on the front lines last fall. So some women chose to do this anyway. So that's what I used to say. And then we got more data. So now we have data showing that this seems to be completely safe. And so my recommendation now is women should get vaccinated if they're pregnant. And part of that is because women who are pregnant can also catch COVID. And they can die from COVID, and they're more likely to get more sick from COVID. And it's not high rates. We're not talking about 20% of women, but it's the risk of that is higher than any perceived risk of actually getting vaccinated. Are there any questions about that? I talked with a person couple weeks ago who was going through in vitro fertilization through that process. And I advised that person to avoid vaccination at that time because that's a delicate hormonal process, and vaccines do cause your immune system to turn on. And what I told that person was, I'd like you to talk with your IVF physician, because I'm not a specialist in that area, and see what they would say. But then once you achieve pregnancy and once things seem to be going okay, I don't have any data to tell me that I should worry about you getting a COVID vaccine, just like influenza or anything else. Remember, these vaccines, they're mRNA vaccines. They do not enter the nucleus anywhere, so they have no capability of altering your DNA. They cannot do that. That's a one-way door. They don't get back in. So I think that's safe, and you may also be offering protection to baby through passive antibodies that pass through the placenta. Also with breastfeeding, passive antibodies do get into breast milk and protect people that are too young to get vaccinated from getting COVID. My kiddos now are 13 months, and they continue to breastfeed in part because we're continuing to give them those passive antibodies and hopefully offering some degree of protection. Because as a very, very young child, their risk of getting severe COVID is higher than, say, a 4 or 5-year-old. So that's that. Talk to your OB. If your OB thinks it's okay when they know your specific situation, I'm okay with it because I think we have good science to support it. What about fertility? So many young women have raised concerns about fertility with these vaccines, and it's important to know that every vaccine that has been approved has always had this thing follow it where people that don't want people to get vaccines in general say that it's going to cause infertility. That's been true of polio and influenza and MMR and everything else. This is a recycled thing that keeps coming up about every vaccine. In this case, what they did is they said, well, there's a part of the spike protein that looks very close to syncytin 1, which is a protein that's in placenta, and we'll make a leap of faith that that might cause the placenta not to form, and that might cause infertility. Remember, infertility happens, and it's sad when it happens, and I have people in my life that have gone through that. But that doesn't mean that COVID vaccines are causing it. So if you were trying to figure out, do COVID vaccines cause infertility, you would want to look at, are women able to create placenta after they've been vaccinated? And it turns out, yes, they are. We have reports of thousands of women that have achieved pregnancy after vaccination. There's also this study here where this is from an IVF clinic, where basically they took women that hadn't been vaccinated and compared them to women that were vaccinated, and they looked at rates of implantation. And remember, these are folks that have had trouble getting pregnant. They didn't see any difference across the board between people that were vaccinated or were not. Remember also that if you think about that immunity process, the spike protein is just one protein, but it is made naturally if you get coronaviruses in general. So the common cold coronaviruses, or if you get COVID, you'll also have that same antibody. And we are not seeing increased rates of infertility in women that have had coronaviruses before or who have had actual COVID-19. So the summary is there's just nothing to this fertility myth that's been out there, but I understand why it's spread like wildfire. And we actually talked about this back in December too, because my concern was that this was going to keep a lot of people from getting vaccinated. I don't think anything out there supports this concern. I don't think that COVID-19 vaccinations cause infertility. And I always say, if you really want to know how I feel, then let me tell you, my 12-year-old got vaccinated about 3 months ago, and I don't have any concerns about her fertility, period. So one thing that is important to note is that these vaccines do cause some inflammation in your body. That's the whole point. And so women have reported that they had changes in their menstrual cycle associated with vaccines. That is true. And that also happens with women that get COVID or other vaccines as well, because you're causing some inflammation. Those stories spread like wildfire through social media, but nobody ever follows up 2 months later and finds out that, oh, the cycle went back to normal. So science is going to approach the menstruation question in detail so that they can say vaccine versus otherwise. Did it cause dysmenorrhea? Did it cause changes in cycle? Is there anything to that concern beyond stories that we hear on social media that are not confirmed? But remember, that's been true of all sorts of things, including getting COVID. We're getting close to the end here. So I think social media has really not helped us on this. Social media acts as an accelerant, especially around division. It creates echo chambers, and it also pays attention to what you like, and so it gives you more of what you like, and it does that to all of us, and so you stop seeing different perspectives. It's also not good at back and forth communication, and so it really leads to what I think is an angry environment that doesn't actually get us any further down the road. So my advice would be to shut it off. It's not doing us any good right now. If you want to do something on social media about vaccines, I would strongly encourage this Vaccine Talk Facebook group. This is a group of people, you're not anonymous, you have to agree to be civil, and you have to back up any claims you make with data within 24 hours of posting. If not, you're removed from the group. And there are many people that have said that when they went on this group and they took the time to ask some questions and share some concerns, that a lot of folks who were just like them were on there too, and they were able to feel like they got their questions answered in a way that was meaningful. So if you're thinking about this, I think this is something that's helpful. Otherwise, you're stuck here in the myth group of people that have a secondary intention of you not getting vaccinated because all sorts of reasons. And we're all networked together, but they're really pulling people towards misinformation. This is a concern we talked about back in December as well. Fetal stem cells are used in certain applications, specifically in this case, both Pfizer and Moderna used a fetal cell line from 1973 from the Netherlands of an aborted baby or fetus. Those cells continue to grow forever because they're stem cells, and they provide basically a standard type of cell that has an agreed upon and accepted and known property. So when people are studying vaccines and all sorts of other medical applications, these cells are used. These are not unlike HeLa cells. If you've read this Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, this lady had a terrible cervical cancer, and her cervical cells grow so well that they live on now 50 years after she's died, and they're used in research because they're reproducible over time. So Pfizer, Moderna use those cells as research. They do not use any fetal stem cells in production, so they're done using them now. None of them are being used. There are no newly aborted fetal tissues being used, period. These are all 50-year-old cell lines that continue to be used. Many people have looked at this. Many of you know I'm Catholic. I think Catholics in general take a very thoughtful and pro-life approach to most questions. When we look at moral balance of stadiums full of people dying versus the potential passive benefit of this particular abortion that happened back here, the leaders of the Catholic Church have said that moral balance favors getting vaccinated. They say that they're not endorsing abortion, period, but it does favor getting vaccinated because of the severity of what we're facing every day. So I think that's something everybody needs to think about. People think about these issues on very different levels, but I want you to know that there's not ongoing use of stem cells being used. If you took what I would consider a very strict adherence to this, you would also have to pass up on quite a few other medical technologies as well, because those also use these types of cell lines. So thousands of people are dying. I think this is something that we know about, and we respect folks' perspectives on it, and I would still encourage you to get vaccinated. The Johnson & Johnson continues to use some of those cell lines in production. If we get a fourth vaccine that does not use any of those cell lines whatsoever, by all means, I'll let you know. Big study just came out, randomized controlled trial of wearing masks. So this is almost an impossible study to do, you can imagine. How would you ever do a randomized trial of whether or not people wear masks? Well, it turns out they went out to Bangladesh and, trying to figure this out. They provided 600 villages, half of them with masks and half of them, just said, keep doing what you're doing. And basically what they saw was a significant decrease in new COVID infections in folks where the only intervention was, please wear a mask. So for everybody out there that's been waiting for some sort of randomized data about do masks work or not, if you're looking for data, here's data. Masks work. They work by protecting us from inhaling particles, and they work by If you're infected, you don't breathe out as many particles. These are a few other studies that support the use of masks. So, this is the last slide from my talk 3 months ago. So at that time, we had very little COVID, so we were transitioning to this more personalized approach rather than public health approach. We have a lot of COVID back again, and I'm telling you, I think it's going to get worse. So I do think a public health approach is again warranted. I don't think anybody wants to keep kids home from school or skip big events that give us meaning in our lives. So what can we do? We can wear masks in indoor areas. We can get vaccinated. And we can be thoughtful. If you're infected, stay home. I think that's what we can do. We are going to see increases, and I think it is going to get worse before it gets better. How worse it gets will depend on how many of us get vaccinated. And remember that we can vaccinate the heck out of the United States, but if we don't do anything for the rest of the world, COVID is going to continue circulating, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to manage and encounter. But no matter what you do, I think we can still avoid fighting about this. I think, if we keep the doors open when it comes to vaccination in particular, I think we'll get a lot farther down the road. The one change I made to this slide was I had a picture of the Good Samaritan before, but this is a picture of the prodigal son. And so that's a story from the Bible. It's in the Gospels, and it's basically a story about how this guy kind of got off down the wrong road and ended up kind of doing some things that he shouldn't have. And at the end of the day, he had to kind of say, you know what, maybe I messed that up, and he decided to go back. And it's a story about, forgiveness from the father, but also from the older brother, the person that had been doing the work the whole time, being willing to, reach out and say, yeah, welcome back. So I think we've all been there. I think we've all kind of made decisions we didn't think were the best, but then we, circle back and come back. And I think if we keep the door open for all the folks that, so far have been kind of holding off on getting vaccinated, I really think that a lot of people will still come around. So, and remember that at the end of the day, when people show up in our hospital and need care, what matters is they're in front of us. We need to take good care of them no matter what. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions. I'm sorry I went long. I knew I would. But yeah. Dr. Kitchell.
Since over 2 million Iowans have been vaccinated, do you have any data on any serious vaccine bad outcomes that reported?
No. And you may have come in after I shared this slide. So we don't have anything specific in Iowa. But I don't think that Iowa specifically is tracking vaccine side effects. That's left to the federal system. The best study I've seen of that has been the Israeli study that looked at vaccinated folks versus unvaccinated. And what they showed was that although there was an increased risk of myocarditis in some people that were getting the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, that the general risk of myocarditis was actually much higher in unvaccinated people because COVID causes myocarditis too. Vaccines are also protective against kidney injury, brain hemorrhage, DVT, and pulmonary embolism for the same reason. There's been a slight increase in, like I said, shingles. I think that's true. I think there have been a few studies that have shown that, and I've seen 2 people that got shingles within 2 or 3 weeks after their COVID shot, and we treat that with an antiviral. And there's some increase in big lymph nodes that then fade off, but that can complicate if you're working up lymphoma for a different reason, or if somebody's getting a mammogram, or if we're doing certain tests that rely on the immune system in that way. So that's where I say talk with your doctor about that. But no, the answer is no. We have not seen any widespread side effects in any way with these vaccines, aside from, like I said, the myocarditis, or with the J&J, the DVT, or the blood clot risk. We don't have data that compares J&J vaccine with the general population who might also get COVID. I would not be surprised if it mirrored this Pfizer data, though, where although there's this, 1 in 100,000 risk of low platelets and blood clots, that the risk of getting COVID is actually much higher. Yeah.
When it was comparing the total deaths between unvaccinated groups and the vaccinated vaccinated ones, like that stadium. Does it make any kind of differential between like a single shot, double shot, or is that just all that have had one series?
That's a great question. This would be people that had completed the full series. So for Johnson & Johnson, that's one shot. For the Pfizer, Moderna, that's 2 weeks after you've finished both shots. That's who is considered fully vaccinated. People that are not fully vaccinated, initially there was some discussion about, are you partially protected from your one shot? I think there's some data that says you might be a little bit, but then I also saw some data later on that showed if you only got one shot, you might actually get more sick when you actually get COVID because you're primed, but your immune system isn't primed in a way that it's ready to shut off also. So I think that data to me has been murky, what is effective of somebody that did a halfway series. So I would suggest that if somebody's gotten one shot that they should finish the 2-shot series. I don't have enough data to tell you about the 3rd shot scenario yet. I generally feel that if you've gotten your 2 shots, we still see that's very protective from death and severe illness in the general population, with the exceptions of deeply immunocompromised or, extremes of age. Did that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Kitchell.
Is there any data yet on what is the risk of a patient developing a COVID infection from an unvaccinated healthcare worker?
So let me find this data. I shared one slide that just talks about, so the risk of getting COVID once you've been vaccinated fully is significantly less, period. You're less likely to get COVID, and whether it's 80% or 60% after 2 shots, that data varies, and it will change over time, I think, the farther out we get from that second shot. Initially, before Delta, even people that got infected, that 10 to 20% of people that still got COVID, they had significantly less virus in their nose. And so the thought was that even if you got COVID, you were not as contagious. And that was actually shown in home risk analysis of people that got COVID and brought it in their house, that vaccinated people were much less likely to pass it on to kids and family members. When Delta came on board, the CDC did similar studies of swabbing people's noses, and they found that there were equivalent amounts of virus in vaccinated and unvaccinated people's noses. So again, remember, vaccinated people are much less likely to get COVID to begin with, but if they do, the virus in their nose is about the same level. I have not seen home studies that document that actually is relevant virus, like infecting people in your house or around you. But the presumption is that it probably is, and so that's where the recommendation for mask wearing has come from, even if you're vaccinated. Which brings us to the question of healthcare. I've not seen any large-scale analysis of patients getting COVID while getting healthcare. I've not seen that reported. Generally speaking, in healthcare, we're wearing masks, and we're wearing them pretty diligently, particularly in healthcare, and as we're seeing people in rooms. And here we're also asking our patients to wear masks. So I do think that the protective effect from vaccine plus mask is fantastic. I think unvaccinated people that wear a mask, their risk of transmitting to a patient who they don't spend a super long time with is less. Could I imagine a scenario where somebody with COVID and they didn't know they had it, spent a lot of time nose to nose with the patient, could give an unvaccinated patient COVID? Yeah, I think absolutely that's possible, but I have not seen any large-scale data saying how frequently that occurs, or comparing a vaccinated to an unvaccinated group, or comparing a vaccinated to a previously infected but unvaccinated to a neither group. I think it's that middle group that is really challenging, because we have some, I think, very thoughtful and smart people that are saying, well, wait, I've had COVID. Why do I need to get vaccinated? I'm lower risk. And they're not wrong. They are lower risk because they've had COVID. But with Delta variant being more contagious and waning immunity over time from both vaccines and your natural immunity, you are running some risk of exposing somebody else if you got infected. Your options are to go get COVID again to reboost your immune system, or you can get vaccinated even after you've had COVID and get basically this dual layer of protection that is incredibly effective. Did that answer your question a little? Okay. The question was just the risk of healthcare workers that are unvaccinated infecting patients. So like Amber said, I think in the group email, if you have specific concerns, and I would love to listen to them and kind of try and figure out, is there, what is the concern, and is there anything to it, or is there something that I can share information with you that may help, especially as we're facing these federal mandates. I would much rather talk with you and see what your perspective is and maybe allay concerns than have you leave our organization. You know, we've stood together for 1.5 years on this, and I just think, you know, we should stick together. Okay, thanks everybody.